He wants to.
He's capable.
He is. He's kind of shy.
Ed, as I said before you came in, he used to lead the singing here. He sure did.
And Zenith too.
Well, I've been to Baptist churches for 40-something years, and not the same one. And every time you go to a different one, they get a new song leader. You learn different songs.
That's right.
So I've probably sang most of them in the end.
You probably have.
We kind of stick to the same old songs here.
That was a new one. I've never seen that one in my life. That's brand new for Rip Snow at 59 years old. If you have a Bible and find it helpful, please turn it to Luke chapter 2. This is where we'll be spending our time. One of the aspects of the Old Testament, and again, the Gospels are not strictly New Testament documents, even though they're in that part of the Bible marked New Testament. They're kind of in between. The people that are living at the time these things are recorded are Old Testament people. That's all they have. So for them, everything is located in that Old Testament Jewish way of looking at the world. And from the Old Testament Jewish way of looking at the world, you've got all of the temple ordinances that take place. So for them, every day, 6 days a week for the Jew, there are 2 sacrifices, morning and evening. One in the morning, one in the evening, in the temple, where a lamb, unblemished male lamb, would be taken from the flock, taken into the temple and sacrificed in the morning, and then another one in the evening. And I was not raised on a farm. So for me, I know where hamburgers come from. I know that that's not some manufactured material. There's an animal that was killed, cut up, ground up. I understand all of that. I know where chickens come from. But for me, as a city kid, I guess you'd say, if you can say that about somebody from Waycross, it's grisly. There's an aspect of it that I can't be comfortable with. I've seen these sacrifices. I've seen one in India where a goat was sacrificed. And the goat was walked into this little rack. And this piece of wood came down that had just enough room for its neck. And then the priest said some things and took a knife and slit its throat while it was standing there. That does something to me when I see that. That's not neutral for me. For some people it is, but it's not for me. And for the people who were part of the Jewish first century, as we're reading about today, it had become kind of regular for them as well. There's something to that. I want us to think about that. The picture of what sin looks like to God, I'm going to say that sacrifice is there to paint that picture for us in a grisly, immediate way. So let's think about that as we look at this text. I'm going to begin reading in verse 8. There were shepherds living in the fields nearby, keeping watch over their flocks by night. And an angel of the Lord appeared to them, and the glory of the Lord shone all around them, and they were afraid. But the angel said, "Don't be afraid. I'm bringing you good news of great joy, which will be for everyone on the earth. Today in the town of David, there has been born to you Christ the Lord. This will be a sign to you. You'll go and you'll find a baby wrapped in cloths and lying in a manger." And suddenly there was a great company of all of the angels of heaven appearing and praising God and saying, "Glory to God in the highest, and on earth peace to everyone upon whom God's favor rests." When the angels had left them and gone into heaven, the shepherds said to one another, "Let's go to Bethlehem and see this thing that the Lord has told us about." So they hurried off and found Mary and Joseph, and they found the baby lying in a manger. And when they saw him, they spread the word abroad as to what they had seen and what they had been told concerning this child. And all who had heard it were amazed at what the shepherds told them. But Mary treasured all of these things up in her heart. The shepherds returned and glorified God, praising God for all of the things that they had seen and heard, which were the things just happening as they had been told. Now, this is the Christmas story. We've all heard it gazillions of times. I can't speak for anybody else in this room, but I blubber like a schoolgirl every time Linus takes his blanket, wraps it around his head like a shepherd, and reads this story right out of Luke on the Peanuts Christmas. Every year it happens. I can't watch it. because I don't want to be embarrassed by the fact that it has that impact on me, but it does. Luke's rendering here is very interesting in that Luke doesn't spend any time about the Jewishness of it. He doesn't. He doesn't talk about prophecy. But you go read Matthew's account, and it was fulfilled. It was so it would be fulfilled. Luke doesn't do that because Luke is a Greek. He's not a Jew. So for him, none of that means anything. What means something to Luke is the facts. That's what he's going to give us. What is all this that's happened here? And so Luke gives us that. Now last week we looked at a scriptural problem, so let's keep doing that. I think it's healthy. There are problems in the text, and one of them is the chronology here. All right, Matthew has them, the child is born, and then they immediately flee to Egypt because of Archelaus. And this gets complicated, and I don't want to bog everybody down in all the details here, but there was a ruler, Herod Archelaus, who became the ruler of Judea. He was very, very cruel. As a matter of fact, he was so cruel that he got, you remember in the text in John when Jesus comes upon the woman at the well? She's a Samaritan. And what does she say? Jews don't talk to Samaritans. They hated each other. Well, Archelaus was so cruel that he got the Jews and the Samaritans together. And they appealed to Caesar to have Archelaus removed from office because he was just so cruel. But there's a chronology problem here. You've got the trip to Egypt. You've got Jesus and Mary and Joseph going back to Nazareth so that it would be said Jesus was from Nazareth. You've got him going to Egypt so that my son came out of Egypt. That prophecy needs to be fulfilled. How does all that work? And then you got Herod the Great, who's still on the throne. These are the last days of his life. And he sends to Bethlehem and has every child under the age of 2 who's a male put to death. How does that work? How do the texts take place and reconcile? There is a time gap here. Between the time of Jesus' birth and all of these other events, there's a couple of months in there. Plenty of time for all this to happen. And you say to yourself, well, I don't understand. Why does it look that way in the text? Ancient historians do not concern themselves with chronology. They just don't. They are going to give you and me, through time, the highlights of the text. How many of you have read Livy with regard to Rome? If you read Livy, he just tells you stuff that's happening. Well, if you read Gibbon or another text regarding the Roman Empire, the chronology is all mixed up. These ancient writers do not care about that. They just want you to know what happened. Here's what happened. And then this happened. But in time spans and chronology, doesn't concern them at all. So you could see easily that Herod, with the several days of his rule left, could have sent the decree to have those children put to death. Jesus and Mary and Joseph would have been long gone. There was plenty of time. I mean, they had to take him back to Jerusalem. She had 40 days of purification before she could bring herself to the temple. If you had a baby, a woman, obviously, you have 40 days in which you're supposed to go to the temple for a purification rite. You're unclean if you've had a child. Now, we can talk about that another time. I don't want to get into it right now, but that was the Jewish understanding. So you've got 40 or 50 days here when all of these events can take place. So it's no problem. You've got wise men, they come, that's got to be allowed for. There's some time there that they stay in Bethlehem and the wise men come, right? There's a time problem there, but it's not a problem for an ancient writer because they just don't concern themselves with it. Matthew records that, Luke does not. Mark doesn't, neither does John. And people say, well, I don't understand whoever you are telling me about this, Rip or whoever. I don't understand how come these 4 recountations of these events are so different. Well, go to a car wreck and find 4 people and ask them any questions about what happened. And you're going to get 4 different recountations of what happened at the car accident. What will you learn from it? There was a car accident. Right? So this is why these things are like this. The Gospels are different because these are really different people. These are independent witnesses writing about the things that they have chronicled. So there's no problem there. Now, there's this issue of marriage. Was she married when they were in Bethlehem, or was she still betrothed? Luke says betrothed. Matthew says they were married. Again, there's just this time span thing where they just don't care about the chronology. It's not important to them. So this announcement comes, as we've read here, to shepherds. That's why in the Peanuts Christmas, what do they call that Christmas story in Peanuts? What's it called?
Charlie Brown Christmas.
That's it, Charlie Brown Christmas. I couldn't remember. In the Peanuts story, you have Linus take his blanket and wrap around his head to be a shepherd, right? This announcement comes to shepherds. Now you might say to yourself, well, so what? And if you were a Jew, it would mean something. It would mean a lot. You had, in Jewish society, you had strata, that is layers. And for the Jew, you had the lowest strata in the society was what was known as the foot washing slave. That was if you were a Jewish home of means, you had a person who, when every guest would come in, when you came in the afternoon, they would have a little laver of water and a towel, and they would wrap a towel around themselves, and they would wash everybody's feet that came through the door. Why? Because this is a rural, agrarian environment. It's dusty. You've got animals reprocessing whatever they eat and leaving the reprocessed material everywhere. You're walking through it with bare feet, so your feet stink. And so when you come into a home, there's a foot washing slave, the lowest person in the structure of that society. What was next? The shepherd. They were the shepherd, the foot washing slave, the shepherd, and then the tanner. That's how those were the three bottom rungs of that society. Now, why was a shepherd so low on the totem pole? I mean, gosh, somebody's got to do it, right? Kind of like Mike Rowe and Dirty Jobs. Somebody's got to collect trash. The shepherds were low on the totem pole because they could not obey the law. They couldn't. It's kind of like in our day. If this were a church of 500 members, and we had a big committee of people making decisions about the things that we would do, like a softball team and a cookout and on and on and on, there would be people creating events sufficient that there would be opportunities, if you want to look at them that way, to be here 6 days a week. I mean, think about it. I get mail from people who are putting on conferences all the time. You need to come to this conference about this, Rip, and learn about this. I could go to conferences every weekend for the rest of my life if I could afford it. They're not free. But my point is that there's this creation within our structures of all of these things to do. Well, it's kind of like that for them. There was no way that a shepherd could become part of obedience to the law because they just didn't have the time. They're in the field with the sheep 24/7, literally. That's what they did. And so whether there was shift work going on or not, it really makes no difference. Somebody had to be with the sheep from 7 in the morning until 7 o'clock the next morning. It didn't matter. And so there's no way they can't go to the temple. They can't go to the morning and evening sacrifice. They can't even go on the Sabbath. Sheep don't know anything about the Sabbath. They don't rest on the Sabbath. So you've got to take care of them. And that's why they were seen as unclean, because they could not observe any of the Jewish law. And God picks them to bring the announcement that the Savior of the world's been born. He doesn't pick Caesar. I mean, if I were writing a myth, I would say the leader of the world, known world, would be sitting in his or her throne room, and a big bright light would flash, and there'd be sparks everywhere, and angels would show up, and they'd make this grand announcement to the leader of the known world in some big, spectacular way. If I were making a story up, that's what I would do. No, God comes to the shepherds. What's he saying? There's everything, if you read anything about the New Testament, you take the New Testament and read through the Gospels with regard to anything that happens miraculous, or the Old Testament just as well. Nothing happens that's got no reason behind it. Those miracles happen because God is teaching through every one of them. That's why today you have to wonder, If we're praying for someone to be healed of something, that's good. That's a good thing. But the fact that we don't see a lot of that today is no different than the way they saw things then. No different. Take a Bible sometime. Sit down and take a pen and a paper and write every miracle in it that you can find. And you'll have a list. Now take that list and put out next to it in big red letters, 1,500 years. Those miracles are stretched out over 1,500 years. God's doing stuff the same way He did through time today. It's a huge span of time. We think about life, we only think about our lifetime. This Bible is recording 1,500 years of history. There are not that many miracles in it when you think about it that way. If you did the math, you'd say, gosh, there's only a miracle happening somewhere in the world, maybe every year or two. That means something, doesn't it? That changes our perspective. So if we were writing a myth, why, we'd have that, there wouldn't be a page you could turn without somebody floating in midair or something else happening. But that's not the way it is. Now, these shepherds are out in the fields all the time, so they can't obey the law. God picks them to make the announcement that He has entered the world as a human being, which teaches us something about the way that God is going to come. Right? Mary and Joseph aren't anybody. They're nobodies in the Roman Empire. They're poor. They don't have a lot of property. They're not people of note. And yet, God chooses to enter the world through them and through her. These shepherds, I don't know any of you if you've ever encountered sheep in your life. I have. They're the dimmest bulbs that you can possibly find. You know, when I look at a cow and I see it, when you walk up to a fence, now this is a city person's perspective, so you got to keep that in mind. I walk up and I look at a cow, and the cow looks at me, and it's usually chewing like this, and it's just staring at me. And the first thought that comes to my mind is there's not a lot going on between those horns. There's not a lot of thought going on in there. Sheep are way down below that. They don't know anything. If a sheep is pregnant and getting ready to deliver the lamb, if the ewe is ready to deliver the lamb, the shepherd had to go help. They don't even have the sense to find water or grazing or anything else. They just stand there, and they'll stand right there till they starve to death unless the shepherd leads them somewhere. I told you this story a few weeks back. I remember I was confronted in Arizona by this 400 or 500 sheep and a guy on a horse. And I'm out for a walk. And there's the road, and it's just covered in sheep. And I thought, what the heck am I going to do now? I guess I'll turn around. And I stood there, and the guy looked at me. I looked at him. The sheep are looking at me. They're not moving. He says, just stand there. I'll take them around you. And he walked those sheep forward, and I didn't move, and they would spread out just like water around me and go past me. They're not very bright. So somebody's got to take care of them all the time, and that was the shepherds. Now we look at this pastoral imagery, and for us, there's a part of us, I'll speak for myself, I don't speak for anybody else. When I think about sheep, and I think about the fact that Jesus refers to us as a flock, that's heartwarming for me. It's not heartwarming for a lot of people, right? How many times have we had a guy up in Pennsylvania by the name of Irv Homer on talk radio. Irv Homer was this very irascible, angry Jewish atheist. Fun to listen to. But he used to call people who believed in God or believed any of this sheeple. He talked about people who didn't question our government as sheeple. That's deep in us as Americans especially. Nobody likes to think of themselves as a sheep in reference to our government, right? We want to be thinking, we think for ourselves. We can decide. We can look at you and say, we don't think that what you're doing is right. We can decide all of that because we're not sheeple. But the Bible has a different perspective on us. That's one of the stumbling blocks for a lot of people. They don't like this pastoral image of us being led like sheep. For me, I find it very heartwarming. We're suspicious if somebody tells us, and that's another reason that people have a struggle with the gospel. They say, all you are is trying to exert power over me. I don't want to be exerted. I don't want to have power exerted over me like a sheep. There's a lot of tension there for us. We appreciate greatness. We appreciate station. We elect people whom we think are a lot smarter than we are to go run for office and be up there and tell us how things ought to be and tell us the way things should be and tell us what to do. Tell us how to decide. We don't know what to do with our schools. We don't know what to do with taxes. We don't know what to do with the roads. We need you up there to do all that stuff for us. That's how we live. We see people as intelligent or lifted out somehow. I don't know how many of you have ever read Plato, but if you go read Plato's Republic, that's the whole image. You know, we still live in that today. You know how Plato's Republic works? There's a group of people that are a lot smarter than most everybody else, and they ought to be in charge. That's how the Republic is written. We still believe that to some degree, don't we? We do. But I'm going to say the Bible doesn't know anything about that. The Bible is totally upside down with this. God comes to the shepherds, the people that nobody would listen to. God comes to Mary, this poor Palestinian 14-year-old, 15-year-old girl that nobody is interested in. God comes to her when she's not married yet and she's pregnant. And she's got a lot of splaining to do as she goes through her life. God comes into Jesus. He becomes incarnate in Jesus, this poor Palestinian carpenter who has nothing to offer to the world. He's not educated. He's not written books. He's not solved any medical conditions. It's so backwards. It's so upside down. I get mail in my house. I got some this week that I'm ashamed to say it, thinking about the trees out there, I threw it out, which is where most of it goes. It goes to file 13, as one of my teachers used to say. And it's a conference on leadership. That's a big deal in the evangelical church. You need to or whoever you are, you need to come and learn how to be a leader and cultivate leaders. And when they use that word, they mean it just like you would mean it if you were in corporate America. That is backwards from the Bible. The Bible doesn't know anything about that from the standpoint of you and me. Nothing. The Bible, all of those conferences are going to teach me something that is the opposite of what the Bible would say. How do I know that? Two powerful examples. Jesus, Last Supper, comes to the disciples, takes off his robe, wraps a towel around his waist, gets a bowl of water and washes the disciples' feet, saying what? This is how you lead. There is no leader. I'm the leader. This is how you are to do it. And they get into an argument. And they say, well, you know, who's going to be at your right hand? Who's going to be at your left? And Jesus says, you don't understand. The Gentile rulers lord it over their subjects, and they love to do it. It is not to be that way with you. These are the people that are going to start the church. I mean, if we were to say, who's a leader? Peter, John, James? Yeah. No. The Bible doesn't see them that way at all. And then you got Paul. Paul calls himself, Barnabas, and Apollos huperetas. What is that? Those were the slaves that were chained to the oars in the Roman galley ship. They couldn't do anything but row. That's Paul saying that of himself. That's the Bible's picture of a leader. I don't lead anybody. This European monarch, as I was preparing for this today, and there's so much in this that just God is trying so desperately to get us to understand that if you and I want to be something, be nothing. And let God bring you to a place where you're doing something for Him. Don't cultivate a sense of ambition towards something. Surrender yourself to God and let God do that work. There's a European monarch, as I was reading, and I saw this, I thought, boy, that's powerful. This monarch in Austria during the Middle Ages, he had a habit. And his court officials said, what are you doing? I mean, is something wrong with you that you do this? He did it every year. You have to realize in the Middle Ages, there's no People magazine. So nobody in the countryside knows what this guy even looks like unless he's wearing the outfit. They've never seen him before other than in the outfit with all the regalia and the jewels and the gold and the scepter and the crowns, all cleaned up and tidied up and ready for presentation. That's the way they know the king. They've never seen the king like we're seeing each other today, ever. So, once a year, he would take off all his robes and he would put on the raiment of a peasant. And he would get on a horse and he would go to a village and he would enter into that village and live with them for a couple of months every year. Different villages. Nobody knew who he was. He had to go in there and earn a living and do all the things that everybody in that village had to do. He had to prove himself every time. And the court officials just said, King, what is wrong with you? Just for security reasons, if nothing else, why are you doing this? He said, how can I rule if I don't know how they live? That is exactly what God has done. The maker of the universe became one of us. And he didn't just become one of us by showing up. He became one in the same way that you and I become one. By being born into a family. With all of the things that are involved in that, he chose that. He chose to come underneath us. That's how God does it. That's how we're supposed to do it. We're supposed to come underneath people. We're not supposed to tell people from on high. We're supposed to come underneath them. And that brings me to one question that I think should surface in all of our minds every day. Do I trust God's goodness? Given all of this information, how he's come underneath us, do I then trust his goodness sufficiently that no matter what I face, I cannot be shaken from that spot? That means a lot to me. And that's the question I think we have to answer. And if it's a question for us, there's another side to this that I would encourage anybody who thinks that way to bring themselves to do. And that is this: ask him about it. Ask him about it. He'll answer that prayer. I guarantee it. Let God teach us about his goodness and who he really is. I don't know where everybody is, but if I've said anything today that gives you a question in your mind, you want to speak with me, you want to pray with me, I'll stay here as long as it takes as we close.